Let me ask you something. Have you ever witnessed a story so dark, so twisted, that even years later, people still whisper about it like it's a nightmare they can't completely wake up from? Because that's what this is. Picture a black man, towering, talented, hungry for a chance, walking through life with a notebook full of poems he wrote as a child. Picture him chasing music like it was oxygen, believing hip-hop was the one thing that could lift him out of every shadow that ever followed him. Now picture that same man, barefoot, naked, covered in blood, standing in the middle of a California street with his head tilted back toward the sky, as if begging God to explain what had just happened. People didn't ask questions. They didn't look for context or pain or history. They just pointed at him and said, "Monster, cannibal, the dark side of horrorcore." But here's the part nobody ever tells you. Before the headlines, there was a broken neck. Before the mugshot, there was a studio filled with gang members who shouldn't have been there. Before the terror, there was a man sitting alone in withdrawal, drowning in pain meds he no longer had, reaching for anything that could numb the hurt. And behind all of it, behind the blood, the courtroom, the life sentence, there's a trail of lost evidence, missing fingerprints, a lawyer with too many conflicts, and a mother who believes the wrong man is behind bars. This isn't a horror story. This is a man's life, rising, collapsing, and disappearing into a system that swallows black men whole. Tonight, we walk into the world of Big Lurch. Not for shock, not for spectacle, but to understand how a dream became the kind of nightmare America never forgets. Before the world labeled him anything, before the headlines, before the courtroom, before the single moment that would erase everything he worked for Big Lurch was just a boy named Antron Singleton. Born on the 15th of September 1976 in Dallas, Texas. And Texas, in the late 70s and early 80s, wasn't easy for a tall, quiet black kid trying to find his voice. The world around him was loud crime, poverty, grown folks, chasing bills and second shifts, but his own voice sounded small, so he found a place to put it. At 7 years old, while other kids were outside running through heat waves and dust, Antron sat with a pencil and paper, writing poems. Soft words, sharp words, words a child shouldn't have to feel. He didn't know it yet, but he was building the skeleton of the artist. He would become line by line, rhyme by rhyme, using language the way some kids use prayer. By the time he reached his teens, hip-hop wasn't just music anymore. It had become a lifeline for an entire generation of black youth. Dallas was pulsing with mixtapes, house parties, backroom shows, and underground energy. And Antron, now taller, now stronger, now stepping into himself, fell headfirst into it. He started rapping over other artists' beats, studying flows like textbooks, trying to shape his own voice. Local shows turned into small crowds. Small crowds turned into whispers. That big kid can rap. The tall one, the one they call Lurch. The nickname came naturally. At 6'7", with long limbs and a presence you couldn't ignore, friends compared him to Lurch, the towering butler from the Addams Family. What began as a joke became a label, and what became a label eventually became an identity. Big Lurch. But dreams don't wait for comfort. They push, they pull, they demand movement. So when his father relocated to Vallejo, California, Antron saw a window open, a rare, precious chance to step into a bigger world. He took it. Vallejo was different. The Bay Area, in the 90s, was a breeding ground for raw talent. E40, Mac Dre, Mac Mall, Sibo, the whole mob music wave. The streets were alive with creativity and danger in equal measure. To survive there, you needed craft. To rise, you needed community. When Big Lurch arrived, he didn't walk into luxury. He didn't walk into studios, lit with opportunity. He walked into a garage, a cold floor, borrowed blankets, the reality of starting over with nothing but ambition. But that's where the Bay found him. He crossed paths with Mac Mall, who saw potential in the tall newcomer, and introduced him to renowned producer Mike Mosley. And Mosley wasn't just anybody. This was a man who'd worked with E40, Mac Dre, Sibo, Selly Cell, Richie Rich, even the legendary Tupac Shakur. Mosley saw something in Lurch's talent, buried under struggle, discipline hiding beneath hunger. He took him in. He gave him a chance. He gave him a couch, a place to rest his body, and a studio to rest his soul. And Lurch didn't waste it. In 1996, Lurch landed what every hungry rapper dreams of, a feature with E40 on a track called Record Haters. This wasn't small. This wasn't luck. This was the kind of moment capable of flipping a man's entire life. More collaborations followed RBL Posse, Mystical, Sibo. His voice grew heavier, deeper, more textured. He was becoming impossible to ignore. Then Mosley brought him into a new group called Cosmic Slop Shop, pairing him with Rick Rock and Dooney Baby. They signed with MCA Records and dropped their debut album, The Family, in 1998, featuring the single, Sinful. The album didn't chart like they hoped. The group split, but Big Lurch, he didn't stop. He hustled. He wrote. He put mixtapes on the streets. And when he collaborated with the late Mac Dre on the track Fire, he tasted the edge of the success he'd been chasing since childhood. He was right there, right on the cliff of becoming something bigger, right before life twisted into something he never could have predicted. For a moment, it looked like life was finally opening its hands to him. After years of sleeping on couches, chasing studio time, and holding on to hope harder than most men hold on to breath, Big Lurch was standing on the edge of something real. He had features with artists who defined the Bay. He had producers who believed in him. He had a place in the room, something he'd fought for since childhood. But just as the music grew louder, life found a way to silence everything. In 2000, one day after his birthday, he got into a car to head back to Texas for his grandmother's funeral. It was supposed to be a quiet trip, one of those long drives where a man thinks about family, memories, promises he made but never kept. Instead, a drunk driver crossed his path and turned metal into weapons. When they pulled him from the wreck, his neck was broken, his body was shattered, and the dream he'd carried for decades suddenly became heavier than he could hold. The pain didn't just live in his bones, it lived in his breath, in his sleep, in the way he tried to move through the world. Doctors gave him morphine, and for a moment the world softened. But the human body remembers trauma. It speaks in sparks of agony that medicine can't always chase. When the prescription ran out, the pain stayed. And in that space, between suffering and silence, PCP slipped into his life. Not as a party drug, not as a thrill, but as a way to feel nothing, even just for a moment. He wasn't the type to chase highs. He barely drank. He smoked weed, nothing more. But pain has a way of bending a man's rules. It has a way of pushing him toward whatever quiet he can find. And in the circles, he found himself in crowded rooms, late-night sessions, people dipping cigarettes into liquid sherm. PCP was everywhere. It offered numbness. It offered escape. And little by little, it began to take from him what music once gave. Around this time, record labels started calling again. Some wanted to help. Some wanted the image. And then came Stress Free Records, run by Milton Grimes, the attorney known nationwide for the Rodney King case. Grimes promised support, structure, a comeback. But the studio he placed Lurch in wasn't built for healing. It was crowded with gang members, tension, and eyes that made the room feel smaller than it was. Lurch was a blood. Not everyone there was. And the air grew sharp with unspoken threats. It's hard to make music when you don't feel safe. It's hard to create when you're looking over your shoulder. He tried to walk away. He tried to leave the label, but contracts don't disappear, and pressure doesn't loosen. He returned to Texas for space, but space cost money, and music still demanded resources he didn't have. To fund his comeback, he started hustling again. This time, the law caught up. A drug charge sent him to jail, and when he bailed out, the same man who once promised opportunity showed up again, offering help on the case, but only if Lurch returned to the studio. To the same environment that had already broken so many pieces off of him. He went back, because a man without options will choose whatever doorway is still open. And by the time he stepped into those rooms, again, those nights full of smoke, paranoia, and fractured trust, his life had already begun moving toward a place he couldn't come back from. By the spring of 2002, the world around Big Lurch had become a blur that even he couldn't fully recognize. Nights bled into mornings. Mornings bled into confusion. The line between pain relief and losing control grew thinner every day. The friends who once pushed him forward were now the same people pushing sherm into his hands, telling him to take another hit, telling him it would make the pain easier. In rooms thick with smoke and paranoia, reality stopped being a steady thing. But even through the haze, he still had moments of clarity, moments where he talked about making music again, about rebuilding, about finding a way out. People close to him said he was drifting, but not lost. Just trying to hold on. Trying to balance the weight of addiction, injury, pressure, and fear. But balance is fragile, especially when the people around you don't want you grounded. The days before the murder were messy and heavy. The house he stayed in wasn't a home, it was a trap spot filled with drugs, arguments, and people who didn't always have good intentions. They used PCP like it was water. They passed it around, laughing, daring each other to go deeper into the fog. And for a man with a broken neck, an unstable mind, and a dream slipping away, it became harder and harder to step back. The 10th of April, 2002, began like any other day for the people inside that apartment. But by the end of it, a woman named Tynesha, 21 years old, a mother of two, an aspiring model would be dead, and Big Lurch's entire life would be over. The official story painted Lurch as a monster. A man so high on PCP that he forced his way into the apartment, attacked Tynesha, stabbed her repeatedly, tore her lung out, and stumbled into the street naked and covered in blood. It was the kind of story the media devours. A rapper, horrorcore, PCP, gore, outrage. It didn't take long for headlines to bury him alive. But the deeper you look, the more the story fractures. Reports said Tynesha had large amounts of PCP in her system, an amount that experts claimed she could not have willingly taken herself. They said it was poured down her throat. They also found fingerprints on objects used to hit her prints that did not belong to Lurch. A scooter, a door, blood stains in places that didn't match his hands. There were mentions of a pit bull in the home, known to chew anything with a smell of blood. The kind of detail that should raise questions in any courtroom, but somehow didn't. By the time police arrived, Lurch was standing in the street, naked, shouting at the sky, trapped inside a nightmare he didn't understand. When he sobered up 2 weeks later in jail, he didn't even know where he was. He didn't know he'd been arraigned. He didn't know the storm waiting for him. His lawyer, Milton Grimes, the same man who owned the label he had tried to escape, stepped in again. But instead of building a defense, he walked Lurch into a strategy that would destroy any hope of fairness. He handed the prosecutor his unreleased horrorcore songs, lyrics referencing killers, movie villains, violence, songs that had nothing to do with that day, songs that weren't even out yet. And in court, the jury didn't see a man. They saw the character the prosecutor painted, a rapper who rapped about death, who must have acted on the fantasies he wrote. They put him on heavy psych meds. They told him not to testify. They gave him no clean clothes. He walked into court looking broken, unstable, frightening all the things the prosecution needed him to look like. It took the jury only minutes to decide the rest of his life. Life in prison. No parole. Case closed. But for many people, especially for those who knew Tynesha, and even for her own mother, the case never closed at all. It only raised more questions nobody wanted to answer. Let me ask you something. After the sentence was handed down, story so the courtroom empty, so twisted, the cameras drifted away, even years later, and the country made up its mind about it like it's a nightmare. To most Americans, they can't completely wake up Lurch was no longer because a rapper. That's what this is. No longer a man who once dreamed of changing his life with hungry for a chance. He became a headline with a notebook, a cautionary tale he wrote as a child, a symbol of what happened when chasing music, drugs, like it was oxygen, and madness collided. Believing hip hop was the one thing that could lift him out of every shadow that ever followed him. They said the streets had claimed another one. That same man. They said it was open and shut, covered in blood, standing in the middle of a California street. The story wasn't tilted so back toward the sky. In black communities, as if begging places God where people had watched the justice system fail. People didn't ask questions. Their brothers, they didn't look for context or pain. There was a different kind of conversation. They just pointed at him. It wasn't about innocence, monster. It wasn't about guilt. The dark side of horrorcore. About procedure. But here's the part nobody ever tells you. About the way evidence went missing. Before the headlines. About how lyrics became weapons in a courtroom. Before the mugshot. About how a lawyer filled with a conflict of interest who shouldn't have was allowed to shape the fate of a man who trusted him. There was a man people who knew the system in withdrawal, could feel something was wrong, he no longer even if they couldn't name it, reaching for anything that could numb the voice. No one expected Tynesha's mother, behind the blood, Carolyn Stinson, the courtroom, a grieving black mother who had every right to demand blood, but instead demanded truth. A lawyer with too many conflicts had been set up, and a mother who believes the wrong man had a history of violence. That a daughter had been planning to leave him that same day. This is a man's life, rising, she said there were bloody footprints, and disappearing into a system, a shoe at the back door, and somehow, all of it went missing. We walk into the world of Big Lurch. She said the story the court accepted wasn't the story she knew, but to understand how a dream became the tragic nightmare, it didn't bring her daughter back. Forgets. But it cracked open a conversation America didn't want to have. Before the headlines, what if the system rushed? Before the single person that would erase everything he worked for Big Lurch was just a boy named instead of uncovering the truth. Born on the 15th of September 1976, whispered in Dallas, Texas, debated in barbershops, and Texas, dissected by artists who knew too well how the world viewed them. Wasn't easy for a tall, quiet black kid evidence trying to find his voice across the culture. The world around him was loud crime. Black artists had created exaggerated personas, chasing bills and second shifts, but his own voice sounded comic book anti-heroes. So he found a place to put it. Prosecutors treated 7 years old as confessions, while other kids were outside West Coast legend X-rated dust, had faced the same treatment sat with a pencil and paper, writing poems. Now, Lurch became the next example. Sharp words. As the years passed, a child, documentaries, interviews, he didn't know it yet, but he was building the skeleton of the artist, peeling back another line by line of the confusion that surrounded that April language, the way some kids focused on the horror. By the time he reached his teens, on the injustice, hip-hop wasn't just music anymore. But the deeper the nation looked, it had become a lifeline, the harder it became to draw clean lines between crime and circumstance. Dallas was pulsing with mixed between guilt, house coercion, backroom shows, a man's actions, underground and the forces that shaped him. And Antron, now taller, and somewhere behind prison walls, now stepping into himself, in a place where noise never stops, and safety is never guaranteed. Rapping over other artists' Big Lurch kept writing, studying flows, kept like textbooks, music, trying to shape his own anyone who would listen. Local that the truth of what happened that day was still buried. Small crowds turned into whispers, still waiting to be heard. That big kid can rap. HTTPS, the tall one, ChatGPT.com/G/G-688 with long limbs and a presence you couldn't ignore. Friends compared him to Lurch, the towering throttler from the A50D. What began as a joke became a label. What became a label eventually became an identity/Big/69. But dreams don't wait for comfort. They push 6, they 0-8, they demand movement. 2. So when his father relocated to Vallejo, California, 155 Antron saw a window open a rare, precious chance to step into a bigger world. 935 number. Vallejo was text equals the Bay Area in the 90 seconds stories percent 20 ground for raw talent E40 80 Mac Dre 90 Mac Mall tons percent 20 the whole mob percent 20 with the streets were alive with creativity and danger in equal measure and percent 20 to survive there he needed craft percent 80 percent 90 percent community LL percent 20 when Big Lurch arrived 20 he didn't walk into luxury 20 inches. He didn't walk into studios 20 lit with opportunity percent 20 he walks into a garage a cold floor borrowed blanket